So, I think this new Spider-Man movie has been part of my life a little bit longer than most. Certainly not as long as the people who have worked on it, but maybe longer than the average internet user, because I accidentally spoiled it back in April of 2021. This year, that is what this year is, I think. And it's a long story, but basically, I was over near the studio where they shoot all the Marvel movies. And as a Georgian and Atlanta native, I'm kind of used to movies being filmed nearby all the time, especially Marvel movies, and I got to see like Civil War being shot and Homecoming and some other films, different things that were shooting near me, Stranger Things, Black Widow, lots of other stuff. But I was over near the studio at Pinewood where they shoot all the Marvel movies, and I was interviewing someone for a documentary. And then I went on a walk in the neighborhood across from Pinewood Studios, which is sort of like a planned community, but it's not gated or anything. It's open to the public. And I'm walking along, and all of a sudden, I see this bus station that looks to me at first like it's just an ordinary bus station, but then it says Queens City Bus Station, and it has a poster of the Statue of Liberty with the Captain America shield that says, "Visit the world's tallest and newest, or newest and tallest Avenger." And I took a photo of it, and I was like, maybe this is from the new Spider-Man movie or something. I don't know. So I took a nice photo of the bus station. Then I took a photo of it with my face in it, smiling very genuinely and wholesomely and in a naive way. And I posted it on the internet and didn't look at Twitter for 3 hours. Then I came back to my Twitter 3 hours later, and it had gotten 1,000 retweets, and it was all over the internet, and every single comic book site had reported that I had just leaked the plot of Spider-Man No Way Home, that the final battle takes place on the Statue of Liberty with the Captain America shield on it. And I was like, all right, well, I didn't know that was going to happen. And apparently, people had already leaked this, like that was one of the rumored leaks, was that the final battle of this movie takes place on the Statue of Liberty. And so I confirmed that leak by accident, and then it confirmed all these other leaks that were part of that leak, and people suddenly knew what was going to happen in the movie. So I was like, oh crap, this is insane. I thought maybe this was just some sort of like public Easter egg they left out for everyone to see, but it turns out maybe it's some sort of big deal thing for the future of the MCU. So I'm at home later, and I'm chilling, and I'm thinking, I hope this thing doesn't get out of hand. And then, through a series of events that might be too complicated to explain, I got a call from Marvel Security, and they said, hey, take down that photo. And I was like, okay, sir, I will. And I took it down, knowing full well that it was all over the internet at that point, and there was nothing I could do. And I came to find out many days later that apparently it was a huge mistake, and they had left up this tiny piece of set outside of the studio and not thought that it would be a big spoiler. And then I came, and my dumbass took a photo of it, and then they had to take it all away, and extra security was hired in the area to make sure no one ever saw it again. So that's my No Way Home story. Nothing to do with the review, but I just thought it was an interesting one. Good to see ya. Glad you're here. I really thought for a couple days that I might be either sued or assassinated by Kevin Feige, and I'm still like keeping over a watch of my shoulder because I never know how mad he might be. So Spider-Man, man, I really get in the Spider-Man mood come Christmas time these days. I think it's that Spider-Verse came out at Christmas in 2018, and so now that sort of reminds me of that every time it reaches the Christmas season. Also, Spider-Man movies are all set in New York City, and that perpetually puts me in the Christmas spirit, because New York is Christmassy for whatever reason, and Spider-Man is set in New York. So Spider-Man, New York, Christmas, Spider-Man, Christmas. I'm just in the vibe this December. It's funny, I feel like this year I have seen more of the shortcomings of the MCU than ever before. And there have been lots of examples of MCU products this year that didn't fully live up to my expectations and I thought should have been much better. But I'm still not really feeling the superhero fatigue. I remain sort of a wholehearted, innocent, eyes full of wonder fan of the Marvel Universe, where with every single release that comes out, I'm like, yeah, I'm excited to see this. Maybe it's going to be great. And then I'm inevitably either, maybe it's great like Shang-Chi, or I'm let down like Eternals, which I didn't love too much. Maybe that deserves a video someday, but I don't know. I don't usually talk about things that I don't love. I think I'm definitely a bit of an unconventional Spider-Man fan by certain standards, because my favorite, like many, is Spider-Verse, obviously. It's the best Spider-Man has ever been on film, and probably the best it's ever going to be. My second favorite is Spider-Man 2. I mean, kind of an obvious classic. And then I go Amazing Spider-Man 2, then Homecoming, and then all the rest can kind of fall in any different order from there. I don't know, man. I love Andrew Garfield. I think he was the perfect Spider-Man, probably the best Spider-Man we've ever had, the best Spider-Man in the worst movies we've ever had. But even despite their faults and their messiness, those Amazing Spider-Man movies, they have style, they have directorial choices, and they have a really strong soul between two actors who very clearly love each other off-screen as well as on-screen. Maybe it was my teen angst and the nostalgia therein, but the Amazing Spider-Man movies were pretty crucial for me during my teen years, and I think they really captured a lot of my feelings at the time. And now, even today, I do think there are things that they do much better than the current Spider-Man movies. I mean, they look better, for one thing. The action was far more stylistic. The music is better, and I must say I do love Andrew more than any other actor who has ever played the part. This is, sorry, we're not talking about Amazing Spider-Man, though. I don't know why I'm going off on a tangent there. I like those movies a lot. They have a lot of problems, but I enjoy them. On that front, I am not one of these people who hates Tom Holland's incarnation of Spider-Man. I love Homecoming. I loved it when it came out. I really like it to this day. And one of the things that really stood out to me about that movie was the fact that it's probably the only true friendly neighborhood Spider-Man movie we've ever gotten, you know? And that's what I love the most about it, is the fact that it's low stakes, it's small scale, and it really feels like a kid stepping into his own as Spider-Man. I will say, as we got to Far From Home, that shtick of Peter Parker as the little teenager who's like, oh, Mr. Stark, oh, golly gee, really started to fade quite a bit from my likability. And that movie, Far From Home, I am not a big fan of at all. It's probably my least favorite Spider-Man movie ever made, because it just felt like a dumb teen comedy, and it wasn't able to juggle some of the more large-scale stuff with that sort of small-scale teen stuff that it also wanted to tackle. So now here we are at No Way Home, and I feel like I'm kind of at this crossroads between many different camps of people who all have very passionate and angry feelings about what they want from Spider-Man, you know? We've long passed the part where everyone is sick and tired of Iron Boy Jr. and this sort of, you know, Tom Holland Spider-Man who's very much the protege of the Avengers, and I think everyone has been sick of that for a while. And I can understand that desire. I definitely also feel that this trilogy has been weighed down in a big way by the fact that it had this burden of a cinematic universe that it had to fulfill. And every movie had to have its big cinematic universe star that would make it more special than it would have been if it just had Tom Holland's Spider-Man. At the same time, I think there's a lot of people who really wanted this to just be the Raimi movies, or to just be the Andrew Garfield movies. And I always really appreciated that Tom Holland's Spidey had a little bit of a different take on the material than the previous Spider-Mans had had. I liked the fact that Homecoming felt like a teen comedy. It had a little bit of Napoleon Dynamite in it or something like that. It was a high school movie more than anything else. I also didn't mind the connection to the Avengers for Spider-Man's origin story. You know, I mean, I felt like Iron Man was deployed very well as this mentor character in Homecoming, and that worked quite well, and even carried over into Far From Home in a decent way. Although, I will say, once, you know, Tom Holland, Peter Parker begins to sort of be like Tony Stark at the very end of Far From Home, right? He's like using the gadgets and all this kind of stuff. That was where I kind of drew the line, and I was like, this just feels like this is not even Spider-Man anymore. Like, that was the point where it felt like, all right, maybe we've gone too far with the Iron Boy stuff. I understand very much the desire that so many people have had for Spider-Man to go back to his roots of living in a crappy New York apartment and struggling between his work and his superhero life at school and pining after MJ and all this kind of stuff. And I definitely think that we've seen some excellent versions of that, both in Spider-Verse and in the PS4 game, which, for my money, is maybe also one of the best Spider-Man movies ever made. I remember, actually, that's a funny story, when the Spider-Man PS4 game came out, I didn't have a PS4, so I just watched the entire 8-hour gameplay as like a movie on its own merits, and it was great, and it was like my favorite Spidey movie at the time. So No Way Home had a lot of things to accomplish. It had an entire fan base to please, and many people who were begging for cameos from Andrew and Toby, and Matt Murdock cameos, and all these villains to make up for. And then you've got all of these expectations of what people want Spider-Man to be. It also has to finish out this trilogy in a semi-coherent way that ties together the previous two movies. It has a cliffhanger from the previous movie with Mysterio revealing Peter's identity that it has to tie in. Then, presumably, the producers wanted some other big MCU character to appear, so Doctor Strange is part of it. And it appears that we're not done with Spider-Man, so the movie also has to set up another trilogy of Spider-Man movies, or at least give us hope for the future. And I would say that the biggest thing that impressed me about No Way Home was the way that it was able to juggle all of those expectations and requirements and elements in a pretty successful way. You know, I mean, I felt like this did a decent job of tying together the previous two movies, the friendship with Ned, the romance with MJ, even some of the high school stuff. I enjoyed seeing the high school teachers back again, and so that was cool that at least that was part of the first act a little bit and tied together. Then I think they did the villains really well. That was one thing. You know, I was so dreading the fact that Alfred Molina's Doc Ock and Willem Dafoe's Green Goblin and Jamie Foxx's Electro, and especially like Sandman and the Lizard and all these guys, they were all just going to be one-liner cameo characters who didn't have any of the depth that their characters had had in previous incarnations. And I would say that was the biggest surprise for me, was that they did have some semblance of depth. And it did really feel like they had stepped right out of the movies that they came from, and they still had the characterizations that they did in those movies. They didn't feel overly reduced. And I was impressed with the way that they were able to make it feel like Tom Holland's Spider-Man in this movie goes from a boy to a man. You know, I mean, I was really dreading, especially after seeing the trailers where he's like, "Oh, please, Doctor Strange, sir, Mr. Strange, can you change that spell?" I was dreading that, you know, the thing that everyone has gotten sick of, the Tom Holland Spider-Man, where he's like, "I'm just a kid, sir, and I don't know what I'm doing." And I felt like this movie did lead with that. It does start with that Tom Holland, but by the end, you really do see that evolution of Peter's character going from a kid who doesn't quite know what he's doing to someone who really does feel the weight of responsibility and expectations and grief and loss, and someone who is prepared to be a superhero after all this baggage has been put onto him. On paper, I think this is probably the best Spider-Man story that we've seen in the MCU. You know, it really felt like a story that was about Peter Parker and not about Peter Parker and, like I feared, Doctor Strange, or Peter Parker and Doc Ock, or something like that, right? Like, this really did feel like a Spider-Man movie above anything else. And I really felt that this was definitely Tom Holland's best incarnation of the character, the one where he got to do the most with his performance. And it felt like he really went on a journey in a way that he hasn't in previous movies in this series. So if you've been listening to me heap all of these praises onto the movie over and over, you might be getting the sense that I'm about to bring up a but. And unfortunately, the but in this scenario is that while I think this might be one of the best Spider-Man stories that we've ever seen on screen, certainly in the MCU, I think it's also one of the most stylistically uninteresting Spider-Man movies we've ever had, primarily because of the lack of vision behind the camera. I like John Watts a lot as a person. He seems like a nice guy. And as a director, I think that he has his lane that he excels within. You know, in previous movies, that lane has been the lane of teen drama and teen angst and teen comedy. Obviously, he does that really well in Homecoming. But I think what No Way Home proves is that he does not excel within the lane of weighty spectacle or anything that involves gravitas. I don't know if it's a fair comparison to start talking about the Raimi movies or Into the Spider-Verse, but then also it kind of is a fair comparison because this movie literally has characters from the Raimi movies and is a take on the Spider-Verse concept. And when you compare it to the Raimi movies that these characters came from, or you compare it to Into the Spider-Verse, which is a same take on the material, it pales in comparison from a stylistic perspective. Those movies have a voice and they have stylistic choices that feel thought out. And this movie feels like with the action sequences, the writers just kind of went, and then they fight. and the VFX artist filled in the rest. There were so many scenes in this movie that I felt like needed a sense of style and weight and gravitas to them, but they were ultimately neutered by the bland filmmaking and unimaginative framing and settings of the MCU. The majority of the fan-pleasing, crowd-pleasing big moments in this movie occur on scaffolding around the Statue of Liberty, blue screen scaffolding, and in condominium living rooms, right? The scene where, spoiler alert, Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire appear for the first time through portals occurs in Ned's Nana's living room. And I was like, is this really the most interesting location y'all could come up with for this massive reveal? Even in terms of Andrew and Toby, you know, I really enjoyed seeing them on screen. Andrew especially, my heart goes out to him. He's one of the best parts of this movie. And whenever Andrew Garfield is on screen, everyone else fades into the background because he's just so much more magnetic than anyone. And yet, whenever they were on screen, to me, it felt like an SNL sketch. The scene where they both first appear in Ned's living room, and then the stuff where they banter and quip on the side of the Statue of Liberty, all of that felt like stuff that you would see on SNL. And I think I was expecting a lot more like Endgame-esque, you know, hero posing shots and action beats that actually felt coordinated, where they got to work together and use their webs in really interesting and creative and cool ways. And yet, for the most part, it's a bunch of CGI Spider-Men swinging around, not very much, mind you. There's one hero posing shot that's kind of dimly lit, and then the rest is just them kind of bantering on some scaffolding, and it felt like I was watching an SNL sketch. I think it was back when I saw Shang-Chi in July that I finally thought to ask myself, how many Marvel action sequences in the past few years actually could be described in my head using the word impressive? How many of them could be described using the word suspenseful? For me, it's not very many. I feel like many of the Marvel action sequences in the past few years have been just kind of noise happening on the screen, right? It's been things, characters fighting, like even I think about the Doc Ock versus Spider-Man sequence in this movie. And that is, Doc Ock versus Spider-Man has been done well in movies, right? The Doc Ock versus Spider-Man fight on the train in Spider-Man 2 is one of the all-time greatest action sequences ever put to film. It's suspenseful, it's creative, it's fun to watch, it's brilliant, and even the fight sequence between the female Doc Ock and Miles in Spider-Verse is really fun to watch and brilliant to see. Uses lots of creative techniques that feel like something we haven't seen before. Then I watched the Doc Ock sequence where he fights Dr. Octopus on the highway in this movie, and I'm like, I don't even remember any beats from that fight. And I certainly didn't feel any suspense around that fight. I didn't feel impressed by it because I knew in my head that almost the entire thing was done in a computer. And that was why when I saw Shang-Chi in July, it was really a breath of fresh air because it was the first time since maybe Winter Soldier or even before that, that I watched a Marvel action sequence and been like, I'm impressed by this. And I genuinely feel like the people could get hurt, which was cool. And one, you know, I think No Way Home does have one standout fight, and that is the fight between Spidey and Green Goblin at the very end on the wreckage of the Statue of Liberty. I thought that was pretty great. But other than that, many of the action sequences here feel pretty devoid of style and definitely devoid of any sense of suspense or any sense of creativity, right? I even look at stuff like The Amazing Spider-Man, you know? The sequence where Spidey fights Electro in Times Square in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and there's that bit where time stops and he's like falling in slow motion and the electricity is running up the railings on the stairs at Times Square, and he has to, in slow motion, use his webs to grab each person's hand away from the railings so that they're not electrocuted. That's a brilliant piece of filmmaking, and it's stylistic, it's gorgeous, it's creative, and I can't think of anything outside of Spider-Verse that matches that since 2014, especially within the realm of Spider-Man. And maybe that's fine, you know, I've always said that Marvel is a studio that is far more about the characters than about the action. You know, Marvel movies are never going to be like Mad Max Fury Road or Mission Impossible, where you come because you want to see impressive, spectacular action sequences. Marvel is always far more about us coming to see characters interacting with each other and getting to be heroes on screen. But even if that's the main attraction here, the way that the character interactions, even between Tom and Toby and Andrew, are shot in this movie just feels so bland and uninteresting and uninspired. It feels like they put the actors in a room, they put up some reverse shot cameras and said, just talk and say funny things, and that's what they did. I don't know, man. Like, by the time this trilogy concludes, if you could even call it a trilogy, because these movies all had movies in between, and so you can't just watch these 3 movies and have a coherent story, but by the time this trilogy ends, it does put Peter Parker in a position where I'm really excited to see where he goes next as Spider-Man. Like I said, I really like his journey from boy to man here, and it does feel like we're prepped for a more quintessential version of the character by the end of the movie. And yet, there is part of me that on a meta level goes, wait, so y'all want me to applaud the fact that you've just returned Spider-Man to the status quo that we all knew he could be at? And that's what's praiseworthy about the ending of this movie, you know? Like, within the context, I think it works really well. But outside the context of it, it's like, so y'all just spent 3 messy movies, to set up Spider-Man being normal Spider-Man. Like, that's what this was? I am reminded a little bit of the Star Wars sequel trilogy in the sense that, you know, it's very clear that there wasn't a plan for the 3 movies. They weren't thought out. They didn't know where they were going. And the third one kind of tries to retcon a lot of stuff and go in a completely new direction because of fan criticism. On the whole, I didn't hate the movie, you know? Like, I'm seeing it 4 times this weekend. I've already seen it twice, and I'm gonna go see it again 2 more times. I enjoyed it. I had a great experience at the theater. It is a theme park ride, like Martin Scorsese has said, right? It's a really fun time, and I've enjoyed cheering with everyone. I loved seeing Toby again. I loved seeing Andrew again. I felt like the villains were handled decently well, especially Willem Dafoe's Goblin. And yet, there's just so little of this movie that will really stick with me in my memory as anything stylistically interesting, any action sequences that I would be interested in revisiting, anything visual iconography that will stick in my head, versus something like Spider-Verse. Every shot I want to frame on my wall, right? And even outside of the animated realm, Raimi's movies, every shot is something I could conceivably frame on my wall. And I know that's maybe not a good metric for judging a movie, and I'm not saying that style is the only way that a movie can be good or bad. Like I said, I think this is one of the better Spider-Man stories we've received. But in terms of style and in terms of presentation, I felt like so much of the gravitas was just neutered by the lack of style and the lack of anything memorable in the presentation. Thank you so much for sticking with this video, guys. I do not begrudge anyone for enjoying this movie. I enjoyed it. I had a great time with it. And by virtue of the common perception at the moment, seems like you probably enjoyed it too. Everyone seems to be liking this movie, and that gets me excited. You know, I mean, I always think it's a cool thing when we're able to have these communal electric experiences in a movie theater. And I don't think that's what all cinema should be, but it is cool to have those experiences. And the night that I saw Endgame will be one of the greatest memories of my life, seeing that in a theater of people who were all cheering. And then seeing this was really fun too, you know? So I always think that stuff really is really special, and it was cool to have that after so long without it during the pandemic and all this kind of stuff. So, you know, either way, I'm glad you're here. Thanks for sticking with this review. And I'm probably going to go and watch Spider-Verse and play the PS4 Spider-Man game. You know, comfort food. Anyway, thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.